Right, welcome back everybody. So next up we have a regulatory and policy session featuring James Lawford Davies of Dickinson and Dr. Helena Wright of the Coller Foundation. So first up we have James Lawford Davies. I'm just going to bring him to your screens and I will stop sharing now. So, James is a specialist life sciences regulatory lawyer for Dickinson. James, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for the invitation to speak this afternoon. It's a very exciting, important topic, and I'm particularly delighted that so many people have signed up to attend this afternoon. I live in a small village in North Yorkshire, and I think, although you're only here virtually, the last time we had so many people in the village was when Robert the Bruce brought an army of Scots through the village to massacre the sleeping English, the Battle of Scorton Moor in 1322. But we are here for an altogether more friendly, constructive discussion this afternoon. I am going to talk briefly about some of the regulatory considerations for companies that are looking to bring cultured meat products to market. And then Helena is going to talk about the wider policy context for the same sort of companies. I've mentioned already that I'm UK based, and I hope you'll excuse me for largely focusing on the EU and UK context, but I hope that the observations that I make will be of wider application and internationally relevant as well. I think it's safe to assume, although I'm not sure it's been tested yet, that a cultured meat product will at the very least be regulated under the European Novel Foods Regulation. I say at the very least because, as we'll come on to look at in a moment, if products involve genetically modified organisms, then there's a different regulatory process that has to be followed for those sort of ingredients. And this regulation came into force in 2018, and it consolidated two existing regulations. And it requires that a novel food can only be placed on the market in the EU if it's been authorized. And novel in this context might seem a bit of a misnomer because it only refers to products that have emerged since May 1997, when the old regulations first came into being. 1997 may seem quite a long time ago. I know it's when I talk about things that happened in the 90s, my children refuse to accept there's any novelty in them, but there had to be a cutoff at some point, and that's where the European Union drew it. And the new regulation from 2018 established a variety of expanded categories for novel foods, trying to take into account scientific and technological developments. And one of those is set out in Article 3, and that's food which consists of or is isolated from or produced from cell culture or tissue culture derived from animals, plants, microorganisms, fungi, or algae. So again, it's safe to assume that animal cell or plant-based foods will fall within that article. The new regulation established an official list of authorized novel foods, and if you're not on the list, you're not getting in. So your product has to be on that list in order to be marketed within the EU. Excuse me. And alongside that, the regulation introduced a centralized authorization procedure. Some companies that have a new product might want to check before they go through that authorization procedure that their product hasn't in another form already been approved, because it is possible, subject to some of the data exclusivity rules, to market products that have been authorized by other companies. But if they haven't, then the company will have to go through the centralized authorization route. And that focuses very much on the risk and safety evaluation that's carried out by the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA. There are, as I mentioned briefly, data exclusivity options. So at the company's behest, it is possible to ask for 5 years exclusivity. for protected data in certain circumstances. And there's an online application process if you're seeking authorization. There's extensive guidance available on the EU websites about this, and the regulation incorporates deadlines by which different stages of that authorization process must be met by the different institutions involved. They are perhaps optimistic, and it's realistic to expect that it can take maybe 18 to 24 months in order to get the authorization through, and some people say it can take longer. But it really does focus in on that, the priority of the precautionary safety assessment that's carried out by EFSA, which you can see there in the middle of the slide, that is the up to 9 months for them to carry out that assessment. The deadlines are incorporated into the regulation, but they are not perhaps comparable to some of the timeframes that you see in the US with the FDA, and there's already been regular mention this afternoon of the Singaporean Standards Authority, which seem to have been able to process novel applications more quickly. In order to be authorized, a product must satisfy the general conditions for inclusion on this official list published by the EU. And that again focuses on the safety of the food in question. It also requires evidence that the food's intended use doesn't mislead, and also that its normal consumption would not be nutritionally disadvantageous for the consumer. Now, these are loaded requirements which require the applicant to provide evidence and data that supports the authorization of their product. And that is where the time and effort and cost arises for companies that are looking to get their product through this process. I mentioned that I wasn't aware of this being tested in terms of cultured meat. It's quite difficult to find out exactly what has been approved or what's under consideration. And the only clear evidence that I could find which suggests the negative is this question and answer provided by the European Commission back in 2018 in response to concern that was raised by some lobbies in relation to laboratory grain meat. This acknowledged on behalf of the Commission that cultured meat could fall within the terms of Article 3. It also emphasized the safety measures that were in place as a result of the Novel Foods Regulation. But at the end there, you'll see that as of October 2018, there had been no applications for the authorization of a cultured meat product at that time. I am aware that others have certainly considered it, and we've also heard several references this afternoon to the Just company, and they, despite being originating in the Netherlands, their products are not yet available in the EU. And there's certainly some evidence and reported evidence that their attempt to arrange tastings in the Netherlands were shut down by the National Food Standards Agency there. So as far as I'm aware, and I'd be interested if anyone knows to the contrary, there have been no applications or authorizations for cultured meat yet under these novel foods regulations. Now, quite a different regime applies if your product involves any sort of genetic modification. On first glance, the GMO regulation does look like it has quite a few similarities with the novel foods regulations, but it is inherently more complex and sophisticated and time-consuming, and as a result, more costly. The novel food regulation doesn't apply to GMOs, and if you do have to deal with the GMO regulation, then that automatically supersedes the novel foods regulation. The GMO regulation applies to GMOs that are intended for food use, for foods containing or consisting of GMOs, and for foods produced from or containing ingredients that are produced from GMOs. And you have to have authorization for the GMO before the product can be placed in the market. The regulation, the directive supporting the regulation defines GMOs as an organism, with the exception of humans, in which the genetic material has been altered in a way that doesn't occur naturally by mating and or natural recombination. A definition that's a lawyer's dream. Happily in the UK, we tend to avoid definitions like this, but you can imagine the sort of arguments that can be had over the meaning of natural and alteration in that context. But the directive did include an express exemption for mutagenesis as a method of genetic modification. And that's where genetic information in the cell is changed by a mutation. And that can occur naturally, but it can also be generated in a laboratory. Now, this was considered in a highly contested and controversial case in 2018, where the European Court of Justice considered the definition and the interpretation and its application to products that were the subjects of laboratory-based mutagenesis. This case related to herbicide-resistant seed varieties, but the definition was interpreted to have a much wider application, including to cells that have been subject to genome editing using techniques such as CRISPR. And it follows as a result of that decision that cultured meat products that use genome edited cells or ingredients and related techniques will be subject to the authorization requirements under the GMO regulation, which, as I've mentioned already, is significantly more complex and time consuming than the novel foods regulation. It requires companies to provide extensive data and data analysis to support the application. And it also, unlike the novel foods regulation, includes a role for member states which have certain powers of veto and national opt-outs. And the product must also be labelled as a GMO if authorization is granted. So an altogether more complex route. I'm not going to talk much about the labelling and packaging requirements because Helena is going to talk about that in the context of policy, but there is a separate regulation which sets out the requirements for companies in relation to labelling, packaging, presentation, and so on. And it's also important for companies to consider how they advertise and promote their products. And there are separate rules and regulations relating to health claims, some at a European level and others at a national level. And so in the UK, for example, the Advertising Standards Agency will enforce the rules as to how foods are promoted and what claims are made as to the health properties of foods when they're sold. In terms of where we stand in the UK post-Brexit, we are still subject to the European rules that were adopted while we were members of the European Union. But going forwards, EU law is no longer of direct effect in the UK. And to try to finish on a positive note, and I think it follows on quite neatly from the question that was put to Jeremy and to Jim, I think given that there is a need and a will for a sustainable, nutritious and a welfare conscious alternative source of protein, and also given the complexity of the EU regime that I've just described, and the challenges that some companies have faced in bringing products to the market in the EU, there is a great opportunity to develop a new regulatory framework in the UK to allow the UK to be a world leader in cultured meat. I'm a veteran of tissue and cell-based therapies for humans, and the discussions and the debates that were had in the 90s and the early noughties about how you categorize advanced therapy using cell therapy, tissue engineering, and gene therapy. And the approach that was adopted by the EU back in 2007 was to draft a new regulation that sort of forced those advanced therapies into the existing definition of a medicinal product. And that is one option, to draft a new novel foods regulation that really properly deals with cultured meats and alternative proteins. But I prefer the idea of developing a UK model that allows the UK to build on its history and provenance in this field. We heard from CPI earlier, a proper world leader in terms of processing. And I saw in the chat that Roslyn cells were on the call, where the home of Dolly the sheep And part of that amazing history that we have in the UK of research and development in tissues and cells, which I'm sure will advance into novel foods. There is this great opportunity to develop a regulation that will protect consumers and allay public concerns by showing that we've addressed concerns that people may have, protecting companies that want to develop products in this area by subjecting them to regulation, but also showing that they have a badge of approval and recognition, and thereby providing an environment within which scientific innovation and progress in alternative proteins and cultured meat can flourish in the UK. But all of that means that the regulation has to be adaptable, it has to be flexible to keep up with science and development. The way it's implemented needs to be proportionate and impartial and objective, and it requires a regulator with expertise that can be efficient and that companies won't have to wait 3 years in order to get the license or the approval that they need to take their product to market. And in what I hope will be a seamless transition to what Helena is going to say, it requires parliamentary and public engagement and policy engagement. So I'll finish there and hand over to Helena.
Thank you, James. Now, James will return shortly to join us for questions following on from Helena's presentation. So next up, as advertised, we have Dr. Helena Wright. Helena is Policy Director at the Jeremy Coller Foundation based in London, where she focuses on policy solutions related to the risks and opportunities surrounding intensive animal agriculture. Her previous experience includes working for WWF and the UK government. So, Helena, I will hand over to you and shut up.
Great, really good to be here today. I'm just going to try and share my screen and hopefully it should work. So I'm going to be talking about the policy and regulatory challenges around alternative proteins, which is obviously quite a cutting edge area when it comes to policy making, and hopefully answer some of the questions and suggestions that have come up, if everyone can see my screen clearly here. So just to give a bit of a background about the Jeremy Coller Foundation, as mentioned earlier, this is a strategic grant-making organisation, and we focus primarily on intensive animal agriculture as well as education-related activities. And one of the initiatives that Coller Foundation supports is actually the FAIR initiative, as Jeremy mentioned, which is one of the fastest growing ESG networks actually for investors, and more than 30 trillion now of investors are members of the initiative focusing on sustainable agriculture. So I'm not going to spend too long on these slides actually, because we've only got about sort of 15 minutes, including questions now. But you can see here the number of different mechanisms really that can be used to both scale up sustainable protein production and also phase down the more unsustainable protein production that has already been mentioned previously. So in terms of mechanisms to scale up protein production on the sustainable side, things like innovation funds, tax credits, and government procurement contracts are all tools which so far haven't been used that much, but which could be used by government to sort of enable and support the R&D that was mentioned earlier. And also in terms of scaling down unsustainable intensive animal agriculture production, such as factory farms, there would be needed some mechanisms to basically support the more sustainable transition for farmers and producers, as well as landscape level regional planning could actually support that process as well. And this slide here just summarizes basically the full range of policy mechanisms, both on the enabling side and also removing sort of barriers and obstacles that might be there in the marketplace as well, both on the supply side, on the producer side, and on the demand end for consumers. And we're going to kind of look at some of these a bit further in the presentation later on. And this slide here from Good Food Institute basically summarizes the alternative protein value chain. I'm just going to pick up in particular the research and development stage, which is something where governments and policymakers could try to support actually the type of innovation that we're already seeing and help that go further. But one of the barriers here actually when it comes to at least innovation, which has been sort of picked up in a lot of the clean technology literature, is actually the valley of death sometimes, which occurs when it comes to innovation. And that sometimes comes in the commercialization stage. So when new technologies and innovations are trying to reach scale actually and reach the market, there can be a sort of a loss of funding or ability to actually kind of bridge that gap. And that's where government and R&D funding can also be very supportive for that sector and that process. And we've been looking at the different range of policies and enabling factors across the whole entire value chain for alternative proteins. This is actually a work in progress here, but this looks across the value chain, right from the production stage to the consumption as well. And you can see there's a diverse range of measures. I'm going to focus on a few of those. So in particular, the support for a transition for farmers, regulatory approvals that's already been mentioned in the previous presentation, and also information and labeling, which is an important kind of consumer focused one. But there's actually a range of mechanisms you can see at the bottom of this slide, which really kind of act as enablers across the entire value chain as well. Some of those are regulation on greenhouse gas emissions. That's extremely important given basically the impact on emissions and on climate change from the animal agriculture sector. On biodiversity as well, we know that livestock production is the biggest contributor to the biodiversity and extinction crisis, and also on antibiotics, as already mentioned earlier. So regulation on addressing these major systemic risks will support generally the transition of the sector, and carbon pricing as well, integrating the externalities into the pricing of food products, and goals and targets as well, which is an area that FAIR has looked at along with producer companies to diversify portfolios, as well as R&D, or actually research centres that could be set up as well to help the sector transform. One thing to note here, I'm just going to touch on the importance of the transition for farmers and producers, and that's extremely important, mostly in order to support job creation and support rural economies, so that obviously there will be sort of job losses in the existing primarily probably in the intensive livestock sector. So there is a role for government and policymakers to support the transition of workers before they sort of affected by these job losses into the creation of new jobs. And that's obviously the opportunity side. And there's a really interesting report actually by International Labour Organization about this last year. It's probably the first of its kind that looked about that potential there. I think it's important, and somebody mentioned it in one of the chat questions earlier, to think, how does this affect the countryside? How does this affect farmers? What are the new livelihoods and new business models that can support a sort of managed transition to a new and sustainable farming sector? And also, how can we repurpose subsidies? So the UK is actually set to phase out its agricultural subsidies now post-Brexit. So that is an opportunity. And there is calls for the EU to basically align its subsidies with environmental goals as well. And there's an important role for sort of rural culture and traditional knowledge as well. I think that's another question that came up in the chat box. And that will prevent obviously people being sort of disenfranchised basically by this transition, and enable new jobs to be created. So one interesting example is the use of millet in India as well. Just going on to the regulatory approval side really briefly here, and some of these developments have already been mentioned. So there is the first sale of cultured meat that's taken place in Singapore last year. There's samples of cultured meat in Israel in restaurant there, and tech incubators sort of popping up in a few countries. EU, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, there is some regulatory barriers there at the moment. The US is kind of not clear in a sense what the regulatory environment will be, but there's a lot of opportunity there. And when it comes to labelling and information, one thing to note, which has been in the media quite a lot, has been some of the labelling restrictions So there was an attempt to ban the word veggie burger, both in the US and in the EU. That's primarily coming from the meat and dairy lobbies. Hence the importance of, a sustainable transition for farmers so that there isn't this type of opposition. And legal experts have actually pointed out, for example, on attempts to ban the term milk, that could contribute even more to consumer confusion, even though it was claimed that basically that was for consumers. But there is some rays of hope. So some of the states which have adopted laws actually banning the term milk, if the group of states doesn't sort of adopt these laws, then those won't come into effect. So that's quite a sensible legislation there. In the EU, unfortunately, there was already a case which actually banned certain terms, which is quite restrictive for the plant-based sector. So terms such as almond milk and soy milk were already not allowed, actually. And there was a court ruling in 2017 on this. You might have seen in the media recently, there's been quite a number of stories, including from Oatly, about this amendment, 171, which proposes further restrictions, actually, on top of the existing restrictions. For instance, terms such as buttery would be banned, actually, from plant-based products, and they wouldn't actually even be able to compare themselves to dairy products, even in terms of environmental benefits. This would be very restrictive. This is unfortunate for the sector, but luckily it hasn't actually come into play yet. So this could still be thrown out under the trilogues discussion at the EU level. So I'm just going to finish there so that we've got some time for questions, but please do get in touch if you have any questions or suggestions about this topic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Helena. Right, let me bring James back in. I will just hopefully able to start his video. Right, we've had a few questions through. The first one is, let me find the appropriate question. So the first question here from Karen says, do you think that the cell lines or components used in the creation of cultured meat products will be regulated separately or only as part of the end product? James, I'll put that one to you first, if that's okay.
Well, it's a good question. It's a bit of both. So there are regulations and rules that apply to the way in which cells are processed and cell lines are processed, for example, and the way that laboratories are run. But it's important that companies have an eye on the end game, because too often we've had to deal with problems that have been identified by regulators at the end of the authorization process, which in fact relate to cell line derivation that started years before. So it is a bit of both, and you need to be aware of what rules will apply both to the ingredients and to the processes, but also to the end product when those are combined.
Great, thank you. Helena, anything to add on that one?
I think I'll leave it there on that one. Specific legal question there.
Okay, next question. There's been some lobbying in the EU for cultivated meat to, well, essentially not be called meat, which sort of, I think, relates to something you touched on towards the end of your presentation there, Helena. The question is simply, what is your view on this? So Helena, sorry, I'll pass that one to you first, if that's okay.
Yes, I think it was quite confusing for consumers as well to see this coming out. I mean, the term veggie burger has been used, for probably decades. I don't think consumers are confused at all by seeing the word veggie burger at all. So it's quite surprising that this came out and it was being claimed that this is to actually help consumers. But I mean, fortunately, there was a big sort of backlash when this came from the meat lobby groups. And there's also been some kind of information out about what is going on in terms of the lobbying of that sector. But I think it really goes back to the sense of people feeling that their livelihoods might be threatened. So what could be important here is what I mentioned about government and policymakers actually supporting people to transform their livelihoods and actually change and accept that, you know, the marketplace is changing, demand is going up for plant-based products, and that's not necessarily something that groups need to be afraid of. Actually, they should really get on board with the changing sector. So I think there's a role definitely for government, public institutions, as well as subsidies to actually reform so that farmers can actually benefit as well.
Thanks. James, anything to add on that?
No, Helena put it perfectly.
Thanks both. Right, we do have other questions, but I think we're starting to run slightly behind on time if we're not careful. So I will pass on any additional questions to James and Helen and ask them to see if we can address them in some fashion in the future. So James, Helen, thank you both. That's been highly informative and very interesting.